And finally, we come to section 5, the taster. So this, as I said, is a mini lecture that I designed in an attempt to draw in themes that students who are interested in any of our degrees, whether social change, American studies, European studies, liberal arts, global studies. I'm going to be touching on issues that are of interest to people who in the past have studied those degrees with us, right? That's so I've designed it on the basis of thinking about my students and what they're interested in, no matter what degree course that they're taking. So the topic of the mini taster is freedom and prediction. And basically the question or the problem that we're interested in here is, how do predictive technologies affect how free we are? So we should start by talking about predictive technologies. What are they? Well, a predictive technology is just a tool that feeds historical data, stuff that's already happened, into an algorithm to predict what you will do next. So they use the past to predict the future. So some examples of some predictive technologies that use this basic model. Well, predictive text on your phone when you're texting someone. They have all the data about the text that you've sent in the past, so they know which words you use most often, so they predict what words you want to use. They also have all the information about all the other people using the app and the words that they use most often, and they use those to predict what you're going to say next. YouTube and Netflix. So you watch a video on YouTube and another one comes up that they think you're going to like. That's based on your whole history of viewing and also the history of viewings of people who they think are like you. Same thing with Netflix. You finish binging a show, they send up another one based on the ones that you've watched already, thinking that you might like it because they want to keep you on Netflix as long as possible. Your Facebook and Instagram feed, same thing, the same basic principle. On the basis of things that you've liked in the past, they show you things that they think you'll like now. So what does this have to do with freedom? So you can see how it's predictive. They use data about the past to predict the future. What does it have to do with your freedom? How does it impact on your freedom? Well, let's start with a piece of literature. The classic science fiction story Minority Report, written by Philip K. Dick, who is a sci-fi legend for those of you who read sci-fi. He wrote the short story that became the film Blade Runner, and he wrote this story Minority Report, which also became a film directed by Steven Spielberg and starring Tom Cruise. I recommend it. It's pretty good. It's pretty interesting. But basically, in the short story, what we see is this sort of dystopia set in the future. And in this future world, they have what they call precrime. And this is a quote from the story. Precrime is the prophylactic, that means preventative, the prophylactic pre-detection of criminals by mutant precogs, so mutant people with a mutation that allows them to see the future, that's what the precog is, by mutant precogs capable of previewing future events and transferring that data to analytical machinery. So basically, the precrime unit is in the police department, and they piece together these psychic predictions from these mutants, and they send out a team of cops to arrest the perpetrator before the crime occurs. So that's what's happening in this story. And so you see them foil various crimes, and then paradox ensues. But for the purposes of just this lecture, I want to keep it short, right? And the upshot of this story, I think, is that pre-crime, this idea of arresting people before they've done anything wrong, violates some really deep-seated intuitions that we have about justice. It detains people who have broken no laws. That's a major no-no in the Western legal systems. You do not detain people who have not violated the law. And secondly, it denies people the dignity of free choice. Before they've even done anything, it says, no, we know what you're going to do, right? And in a way that feels like a kind of erasure of our freedom. And the message, I think, that Dick really wants to send to us is that we would never give predictive technology this kind of authority because we hate the idea so much. We would never give it that authority, and it would be a disaster if we did. So no, Tom Cruise, you can't arrest us before we commit a crime. No pre-crime for us. But on the other hand, you might say, really? Don't we already have this in various respects? Okay, so now we'll turn and look to the law. In England and Wales, you have the Mental Health Act of 1983. So if someone in the appropriate position of authority within the medical community determines that you have a mental health disorder and that you pose a risk to yourself or others, they can detain you, they can section you under the Mental Health Act of 1983. And under the Mental Capacity Act of 2005, if someone in the appropriate position of authority determines that you lack mental capacity, you can't make a decision on your own, and you pose a risk to yourself or others, they can coercively detain you. So this is done with predictive technologies very often, right? Data about the past is fed into an algorithm to predict future behavior. They use risk assessments. That's what a risk assessment is. They're taking data associated with certain behavioral outcomes, and they're taking information about you and plugging it into that algorithm to see if you're a danger to yourself or others. So this detains people who have broken no laws, and it denies people the dignity of free choice. But only a certain class of people. That's why the major debates about the Mental Health Act and the Mental Capacity Act in contemporary legal conversations are about discrimination. People find these practices discriminatory against particular classes of people. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit more. Here's another predictive technology that's being used in the contemporary legal world, a kind of real life pre-crime, which is discussed at length on this wonderful podcast, Hi-Fi Nation. I've shared the link to that with you as well. So there's been this explosion of predictive technologies for crime in recent years. And one example that's discussed in this podcast is this Los Angeles Police Department person-based predictive policing tool. So basically what this tool is designed to do is to trace individuals via a point-based system. So you have an algorithm, and there are certain factors that are in the algorithm that are weighted differentially, and your score on that algorithm determines whether or not the police will engage with you. So one of the things that they point out in this podcast is that there's a kind of vicious feedback loop in this particular piece of technology. If you make it on the list, the police will stop you. But being stopped by the police increases your score. So that means that just being on that list will progressively ratchet up your score and increase the likelihood of your involvement in an eventual arrest by the police. Other worries about predictive policing, well, there are many. I'll just name three here. Some people point out, well, the factors that predict crime often just read like a description of poverty. So rather than pouring money into artificial intelligence that can predict where the crime is, why don't we take that money and use it to alleviate poverty? Other people say predictive technology keeps police always in poor neighborhoods, right? And this is related to point one. And the fact that the police are always in poor neighborhoods drives up mass incarceration of the problematic kind that everybody has been protesting about over the last year or two in the United States. And finally, you can't actually predict crime. That's really important. The fact that the police are interested in you, or that the police are engaging with you, that you can track and you can predict, but you can't predict whether the people the police are engaging with have actually committed a crime. You can't predict crime. You can only predict involvement with the police. Okay, another related form of algorithmic oppression, you could say, is what people are now calling surveillance capitalism. Now, surveillance capitalism is basically the following. So there are all these mega corporations like Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft, and they engage in this three-part process that makes up surveillance capitalism. They gather data on you with any app or user interface that you're on. They're constantly gathering your data on any device that you're on. They sell that data to businesses, politicians, and governments. And then those businesses, politicians, and governments use it to predict and modify your behavior. So every device you use feeds these data-driven corporate interests. And I want to give you just two examples about why people think this is pernicious. So first of all, you're probably familiar with this. They can sell this data to businesses that can then use it to target you for ads. So you're on Facebook and you're seeing ads come up that are really seem nicely honed to your interests. That's because they're using data to predict what you might want to buy. Now you might say, well, that sounds harmless. So what? That's really convenient. I like it when they advertise stuff to me that I want to buy. But think about this. These social media apps that you're on are also using algorithmic tools to try to make being on them as addictive as possible, right? It's not an accident that you spend all kinds of time on your phone. That is by design. There are corporations, multi-billion-dollar corporations, designing algorithms to make those apps as enticing as possible. So you spend as much of your day on them as possible. And while you're spending time on them, this is also well studied, you are warping your sense of self. And what that means essentially is that being on social media makes people feel terrible about who they really are. Why? Well, it's complicated, but one of the dominant theories is that when we're on social media, we present the most attractive, the most appealing version of ourselves. And we come to think of ourselves as being that cool person. Then we go out into the real world and we're disappointed. We're constantly disappointed because we're not as sort of curated and cool a personality as we present online. So now think about the businesses targeting you with ads again. So the apps are designed to keep you on them as much as possible and to sort of keep your attention held, right? Some people call it the attention economy. And just being on those apps is making you feel worse about yourself. And then businesses target you and try to sell you things that target your insecurity. They try to sell you the new makeup, the new filter for your photos that you can put online. They're constantly selling workout equipment and so on. So they've got you addicted to the app. They're keeping you on it as much as possible. Being on it is making you feel bad about yourself. And then they're trying to get you to buy stuff rooted in that insecurity. So that sounds pretty diabolical if you put it that way. Another example of surveillance capitalism is the kind of new use of political propaganda. So now it used to be in the old days, if you wanted to put propaganda out in the world, you had to use the news media. And that meant everybody could see it, right? The vast majority of people could see the newspaper where your propaganda was, or you'd put your propaganda in a poster and it would be out in the public sphere. And that meant people could talk about it and people could criticize it. Now they can just deliver sort of tailor-made propaganda just to your phone, and only you're looking at it. And only the people that the data has predicted will like it are looking at it. And people aren't having a conversation out in the public sphere about it. They're just absorbing this propaganda on their personal handheld devices. So a lot of people are worried about that. Now, some people have said, all these predictive technologies that populate our world, it's really what it's doing is leading us to a new worldview. Some people are calling it Dataism. A Dataism is the view that the entire universe, at the end of the day, including us, is a flow of data. We are biochemical algorithms. And so the idea is we should capture all of this data and then essentially give ourselves over to it. We should listen to the algorithms. Don't fight the algorithms, embrace them. So the historian Yuval Noah Harari offers this analogy. So Angelina Jolie, a few years back in 2013, she took this genetic test that gave her an 87% probability of developing breast cancer. So she automatically got a double mastectomy, had them removed, wrote an editorial about it in the New York Times, and everybody praised her decision. Because, like, well, you got an 87% chance of developing cancer. You should prophylactically have a mastectomy. Now, Harari is using this as an analogy. He's saying, so think about marriage. That's another major life decision. Are you going to decide whom to marry by yourself? If you do, we know that you have about a 50-50 chance. At least half of marriages end in divorce in most places. So are you going to take that risk? Because in the future, they're going to say, hey, we've got this great app. We've uploaded everybody's data, and we can give you an 87% chance at a successful marriage. So are you going to go and be a silly person and kind of go the old-fashioned way and think that you can make a decision like that yourself? Or are you going to use the app? And Harari's prediction, a kind of dark prediction, I don't know how I don't think he feels good about it, is that eventually we're just going to hand over our major life decisions to these algorithms. We are going to embrace the algorithms rather than fight them. Okay, so what I'd invite you to think about is, how do all of these predictive technologies make you less free? Are you less free because you're surrounded by these predictive technologies? That's something I'd like you to think about. But the main thing I wanted to show you was that just in that little short whistle-stop tour, we covered all of these disciplines: literature, film, mental health law, data analytics, machine learning, criminology, philosophy, sociology, psychology, propaganda, politics, public health. And the idea is when you have interesting problems like this, like what are we going to do about the impact these predictive technologies are having on us, you need a multifaceted approach. You need to think about the problem from a variety of different angles. And there are just so many useful disciplines and methods within those disciplines for approaching these problems. If you're a fox, why would you ever want to just embed yourself in one discipline when you could be someone who appeals to a variety of different disciplines to solve the problems that are interesting to you? So, like I promised earlier, here are the email addresses for all the different directors of our different degrees. If you have a question about any of these degrees, I would encourage you to email the director of that degree program. So take a minute to write it down right now, or email me later and I can give it to you. People would be more than happy to talk to you about the degree. And aside from that, I just want to say thank you. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope that I can answer any questions that you have, either now or in the future. Thanks very much. Have a great day. Enjoy the virtual open day.